So let me just pray first. Heavenly Father, we just want to thank you for this opportunity just to be here today and to learn. And we just pray for Brett, Lord, that the information just has like a supernatural touch to it, God, that it ministers not just information, but insight and wisdom as we're thinking about parenting, we're thinking about grandparenting, we're thinking about helping our kids, we're thinking about just even in our own volunteer responsibilities with the young people that we have in the building on Tuesdays and Wednesdays and Sundays. God, that you would just give us insight. Lord, teach us to love our kids and to see them as potential joint heirs with Jesus Christ and treasures to be cared for properly. And in the midst of a very evil world, amidst of an ever-changing world of morals and values changing all of the time, of conflicting messages, that our homes would be Christian homes, that they would be light, and God, that we as families would be salt and light to the rest of the world. So just anoint Brett and just set him up, God, to fill our hearts with your love and your wisdom in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So, Brett, why don't you come? I'm happy to introduce to you Brett Ullman. Now, I don't know a whole lot about Brett, so if you would take a few minutes just to share a little bit about yourself, fill them in. Sound good? Thanks for coming.
Brent?
God bless you.
We're going to really confuse people, I think, with that.
Brent and Brett.
Yes.
Yeah.
I get Brent half my life. You might get Brett half your life. So for those of you here and online, my name's Brett. I come from Ajax, so it was actually a wonderful drive here today because it was a Saturday morning. Any other day of the week getting across the city is a bit of a nightmare. But my background's education. I'm a trained high school phys ed chemistry biology teacher. I never taught that. I taught rotary science to grade 7s and 8s, and I taught a behavioral class, and I taught a class called Section 27. My kids came from jail and psychiatric in grade 7 and 8. It was a fascinating year. But throughout that time, I began speaking, and 8 or 9 years in, I found myself with a pregnant wife and a 1.5-year-old, and I'm traveling 45 speaking dates a year while I'm still teaching full-time. And so I left teaching, and I've been full-time ever since. Well, I shouldn't say that. In the last 2 years, I've had a small change. I began putting my content on Right Now Media, and so my courses are now available anywhere in the world, so my speaking's gone down, and so I went back and took my master's in psychotherapy, and so I'm a half-time psychotherapist, and I'm a half-time speaker/author. I kind of speak on issues that I think we're either often afraid of, don't know how to, or don't want to talk about. So I speak on everything from addictions and sexuality and pornography, dating. When I speak to students, some of my larger talks, I have a new talk on media called Media Navigating Everything, looking at, technology is wonderful, but it's also like destroying us in some ways. So how do we find the balance with that? I have a talk on men navigating everything. How do we be better fathers, husbands, and boyfriends? Parenting is today, and then tomorrow morning I'll be doing mental health, which is probably for me the talk closest to my heart. It's the reason I'm sitting. I'd left the teaching career. I did a program called the Aero Leadership Program, went straight into a master's degree. This is in my 30s, a master's of evangelism and leadership at a school called Wheaton in Chicago, and found myself living an incredibly unsustainable life. I was traveling around 300 speaking dates a year to pay for the master's. And everyone in my life told me to slow down, and I said, I'll be fine. And I wasn't fine. I graduated, and then I had a full burnout breakdown, call it what you want. It actually happened at Lakeshore Pentecostal Camp. And I didn't leave my house for 5 months, and I didn't work for an entire year, and that was 13 years ago, and I'm still unwell. And this is my Aura ring. This is a computer. It does sleep tests on me every night and tells me just how little deep sleep I get. Some days it's 4 minutes, which is just not enough. Another conversation, we'll talk a bit about that more tomorrow. I am married with 2 kids. My wife's name is Dawn. There we go. My wife's name is Dawn. She's a nurse. My 2 children, Zoe just graduated. She did 2 years at Western, sort of down the road here, and then 2 years at McMaster. And she graduated. She's in a gap year and is hoping to go to law school next year. And my son Ben is in his 4th year at Queen's. He wants to be a psychologist, and so we have a lot of education ahead of both of my kids. But our favorite person is our English bulldog, Phoebe. She is the best part of all of our lives. So some ground rules as we go through this. Be a good learner. I think sometimes as Christians we're good listeners, but we're not good learners. Like, do we take what we've learned and implement it back into our lives? I would say find your light bulbs, because we're all different. We have young kids to teens to adult kids to you name it. Have opinions. This might sound weird, but I'd rather you have a different opinion than me than no opinion at all. When the Bible says, like, iron sharpens iron, I like rich discourse, because we only get better as people when we have good conversations. I also say no shame. I'm going to challenge all of us on a lot of different things, but how do I challenge us to be better and not shame us for where we're at? And this is this catch-22 that anyone who teaches, preaches, speaks is kind of in. And so my favorite quote is Maya Angelou, who once said, "Do the best you can until you know better, and when you know better, do better." And lastly, there is hope. We live in a world which is so based on fear. Just turn the news on every night. There are kids doing really well. I was at Queen's speaking at one of their Christian groups the other year, about 225 Christian kids worshiping in a beautiful church. And I'm just like, there's lots of good happening. We talk too often about all the bad that's happening. So how did I get to a talk called Navigating Everything? All my new talks are coming out, like parenting, navigating everything, media, navigating everything. I was speaking one evening. I finished the talk. I was at my booth, and a father came over, and he said, "Brett, can I ask you a question?" I'm like, "Sure." He said, "How do I talk to my daughter about sex?" I'm like, "Great question." And I went to answer, and he interrupts me and says, "Wait, 1 second. She hates me. Go ahead." And I said, like, "What?" And he goes, no, forget about that. How do I talk to her about sex? And I said, "No, forget about sex. What do you mean she hates you? Because that's everything." And I said to him, like, if you don't have a relationship with your kid, you will not be speaking to them. You just don't have the influence in their life to be able to talk about that issue. And on my way home, I realized I have nothing about the foundations of parenting. And my wife and I began to chat, and we began to walk through things. And this talk is really the things that we wish we had when we had young children. So I know I'm a fast talker, and there's a lot of info. So there's 3 things that I've done. Number 1 is that there's a Google Doc for this talk. And the Google Doc is on my website. It is filled with who you should follow and all the book links and all those kinds of things. There's an Amazon shop. If you go to my website, which is the last one, across the top is social media. The Amazon A is in there. And then there's the categories: mental health, parenting, media. And my website is I'm a curator, I often say. It's about 1,500 links. Parenting, media, whatever, and they're all listed there. So as I began to research, I became very overwhelmed. There's around 75,000 parenting books. At any moment, they say there's 10 to 20 new parenting books a week that come out, many with completely differing thoughts and ideologies. Some from, pastors or theologians from the same denomination with 2 differing views on things, which makes it always interesting of, well, where do you go? So my wife and I together kind of realized there's 4 things we wish we had. This is not an exhaustive list, but the 4 things are, what is parenting? Because if you don't know what it is, how on earth do you know what to do? And parenting is one of these things of most people read what to expect when you're expecting, and then you have a baby, and then you look at each other and say, what's next? Like, what do we do now? Number 2 is time. Number 3 is communication. And number 4 is discipline. And I put at the bottom Christian faith. I do think our Christian faith should touch all aspects of our lives. Our worldviews affect our values, and our values affect our actions. So what is parenting? I began to post online, and within minutes, a person wrote me this. They said, the goal of Christian parenting is to raise godly children. And I remember kind of looking at that, and then I emailed the person back, and I said, what do you mean by, there's a lot of Christianese in that. Like, our daughter didn't sleep through the night till she was 2.5 years old. Is that a Christian issue? Because I think that's, like, is that a swaddling or a let him cry it out issue? And he never wrote me back, and so I didn't really know what to say. The next one, a book by Trophy Child. Ted Cunningham said this: our job as parents is to raise children who love Jesus and leave home as responsible adults. I love that. Now, leave home is becoming the new change. Now, where I live in Ajax, I'm outside of Toronto, a basement apartment is $3,000 a month. There's no, I'm 53, there's no go get a $500 basement apartment with a buddy. That just doesn't exist. So I say a lot now, our kids need to be moving forward, not moving out. There may be a different new intermediary thing with that. But we prepare them for a lifetime of following Christ, working hard, being married, and raising a family. Now, hundreds of people wrote me and said to raise happy kids. And I would say to all of them, I disagree. Because that is an emotion. That is not your rubric for parenting, whether you're happy or not. Just like your marriage, you're not always happy every day. It's just an emotional kind of thought. But then I read a book by, another one by Trophy Child, and he says this: they will not be with me forever, so I prepare them accordingly. In my life, I call these stop quotes. I actually stop reading and I write it down. Like, there is weight to this quote. Like, our kids will not be with us in the way that they are when they're younger. I now have 2 kids today. My daughter's downtown. She now works for the Raptors on their interactive team. She said last night on the game she was in one slide. Somewhere in the video you saw her. But she's on her own. My son's at Queens today in Kingston. So all the things that we've taught him, he's now kind of on his own for a lot of them. So as I began this talk, I'm like, well, what does the scriptures say in parenting? And George Barna said in the first book I read, if you have sought spiritual guidance in parenting, you might have been surprised to discover how little instruction God gives us in this regard. There are 2 things I get hate mail for. This would be the first one. I cannot tell you how many people write me and say, how dare you tell me the Bible says nothing about parenting? And I just write back gracefully, you do know the word parenting is only 100 years old. Like, it's not in the Bible, just like Teslas aren't in the Bible, and Big Macs aren't in the Bible, and iPhones aren't in the Bible. Parenting as a verb is kind of a newer thing. It's like teenagers isn't in the Bible, because teenagers, that kind of term came in the 1950s as a marketing kind of campaign. Now, the Bible talks about who we're to be as people. And I think if you become who the Bible calls us to be, you will probably be a good parent as well. Never forget, kids in the Bible, I mean, often you were married at 11 and a half, 12, 13, 14. Can you picture if you have a middle schooler today? Like, very, very different world. Now, children are mentioned throughout the Bible. Deuteronomy, it talks about teach them to your children. Now, the actual word isn't teach. The actual word has an emphasis like inscribe, carving with a knife into wood or rock. Proverbs 22:6. I have to be honest, I was concerned as a faith-based person when every single book I read used this verse as a promise and not as a proverb. Proverbs is the book of wisdom. It's the book of adages. It's not what we would call determinism. If this, then that. I can't tell you how many people in my career come up to me weeping, adults after, and said, my kid has done this, they're 15, 18, whatever age, and I was just told by the church, well, I guess you didn't train up a child the way you should go. And they weep and they leave and they feel not all good parents have good kids and not all bad parents have bad kids. I do think most good parents, I do think most people who train up a child will have good kids. Colossians and Exodus are very authoritarian, like do what I tell you. And let's just put a pin in Proverbs 13:24. We won't unpack that until we get to a discipline. So, parenting stages. I love this. Some of you might know the name Andy Stanley, the pastor in the U.S. His wife Sandra said there's 4 stages: discipline, training, coaching, friendship. I love it. Now, don't get hung up on words. You discipline throughout, but differently. You train throughout, but differently. You're a coach throughout, and you're a friend throughout. Every few months, things come through kind of on emails. Things kind of get trendy in our Christian community. Often it's like, you're not a friend, you're a parent. And I'm like, just click delete. You have to have a bit of a friendship with your kid as well. It doesn't, right? It's not an all or none kind of conversation. And if you ever start Googling parenting stages, you will soon be given parenting styles. Now, one of the first people I would encourage you to follow, one of the things I think we should do with social media is follow really good people. So every time you go online, you are just given really amazing content. So this is on the Google Doc, but the first one is a woman named Allison Schaefer, S-C-H-A-F-E-R. She's a parenting expert, if you want to use that term, from Toronto. If you ever watch Global News, she's the resident kind of mom they bring on. She says that there's a lot less parenting styles than names to describe them, and I would agree. Now, before I give you some, I want to give you one thought. Tim Elmore said, from this decade, which was the 90s, adults began to believe that our world was less safe than ever and our kids needed oversight or direction at all times. And he said 4 things have happened, and I wonder if you would agree. Number 1, kids began feeling entitled to special perks because we said that they're special. 2, kids began feeling unafraid or unsafe, afraid, and even paranoid because of the parents' behavior. Kids began believing that they were fragile and could not handle adversity. I would add in because of their parents' behavior. And kids began embracing the narrative that the world is full of evil people who could harm them, which kids only learn because of their parents' behavior. How we parent matters. So I have two pages of these. Now, we are not going through all of them. The blue highlight is the main ones. The stars are the ones you should be in the dead center. Christian spiritual parenting. I want my kids to become Christ followers for sure. Top left is one of the big things these days. We call it attachment parenting. Now, if you've ever taken a psych class, back in the 1990s, Dr. William Sears talked about this, but this was breastfeeding longer than everyone else you know, co-sleeping longer than everyone else you know, not this. Modern attachment parenting is just the idea of having the best relationship you can with your kids, right? It's this, your kids like an electric vehicle go into life and they lose all their energy. They come back to a place of love and acceptance and fun, and the list goes on. And conscious parenting is no different. Another author, Tina Bryson, and a guy named Dr. Dan Siegel, wrote a book called The Power of Showing Up. And they talk about how if kids feel, I'm not a big fan of alliteration, but if kids feel seen, safe, and soothed, they'll feel secure. And what our kids need is this secure attachment. Now, put this into a faith conversation. The greater attachment you have with your kids, the less chance they'll walk away from Christ. It's also, I have a new talk on marriage I'm doing. The greater your marriage is, the less chance your kids will walk away from the church. Like, there's incredible parallels to some of these things. Now, in the dead center, at the top, intensive parenting, most of us don't know that word. Helicopter parenting, we all do. We hover over and we swoop in. My favorite is Black Hawk parenting. Years ago, a movie, Black Hawk Down. Black Hawk parenting is when we swoop in, we blow everything up like a helicopter can, and then we fly away. At the bottom is gentle parenting. Now, if you want to wade into a debate, this is the debate you wade into. Gentle parenting for many years has been a phenomenal conversation. I would say I'm a gentle parent, meaning I am not rough and yelling with my children. Today, the conversation is gentle parents create weak kids. And I think there's a huge conversation we need to have here on what do we mean by gentle parenting. Because I've even finished speaking dates and two people are arguing, and we're arguing apples and oranges. And so depending on your views of this, we can have a different discussion. Overparenting, the more we overfunction as adults, the more our kids underfunction. This would be the biggest thing I see today. And I would just say after all of these, like, anyone confused? You're kind of like, which one should I be? People are often like, just tell me. And so I would say this, the only parenting style you should be is this. It's called authoritative. This is an axis, support and warmth on one axis and control and demand on the other. Everything I just told you, and I have I think I'm at 75 parenting styles. I could plot them all on this chart, right? So love and support and push our kids along, like control and demand, that's what our kids need, right? They need to be moved along, and we do it with love. If you don't have love, you're authoritarian. Do what I say, do what I tell you. If you're not pushing your kids forward, you might just be permissive. And if you're not involved and there's not love, they're just uninvolved. Now, overfunctioning, Tim Elmore says, overfunctioning in parenting simply means doing too much for our children, intervening and removing common struggles they may experience in their day. When we insulate our kids, side note, you can buy a bubble wrap outfit for your child on Amazon. It's kind of a joke, but just that it's there just makes me kind of laugh. But when we insulate our children, we fail to prepare them for the world that awaits them. Julie Lythcott-Hames, another book. Julie was, I don't know if she still is, the Dean of Admissions for Stanford University in the US. She began seeing a change in the kids coming into university. She said this, why did parenting change? From preparing our kids for life to protecting them from life, which means they're not prepared to live life on their own. This, to me, is the biggest switch that happened in the 1990s. We stopped preparing people and began protecting people. Talk to anyone who works at a college or university about the new kind of group of students heading in these days, and it is quite interesting. Like, one person said, please don't ever tell my university, and I'm like, I won't. And she said, we now run a program for first years, predominantly first-year men, and we have to tell them to shower. And I burst out laughing, and she didn't. And I said, you're not laughing. She said, we have to because mom or dad had always told them to, and they don't have basic functioning skills as they walk in. They don't know how to study, don't know how to cook, don't know how to do laundry, don't know how to take public transit. And this is what Julie says in her book. She says she worries that college kids today, college university, are not quite fully formed humans. It's an interesting statement. So I'm going to play a quick game, and no matter where you are, just kind of, we're going to ask the question, like, you might be overparenting if you. So you might be overparenting if you drive to your kid's grade 2 class each day to cut their food into pieces at lunch. This is a teacher around the corner from where I live. You drive your kids to school and then walk them to the door of their classroom, not just like drive them to school, which I also think that it's okay for kids to take public transit or walk or other things. Number 2, you send your kid to camp. Both my kids have been part of a camp called Minneowie up in Huntsville, and parents would actually send 2 phones, one to give to their counselor, or if it's a church retreat, the youth pastor, and then one they hide, and they then give what? Proof of life at the end of each day. You go on a job interview with your child. 1 in 10 Canadian teenagers. Like, often you hear a bit of a groan, like, all statistics are wrong, right? All statistics are incorrect. It's a snapshot of a time and a place, but this should be 1 in 10,000. 1 in 10. Like, no one will hire a kid with mom or dad there. Now, there's a reason parents are going, is because we're creating fearful kids. So fearful kids don't know how to talk, yet alone walk alone into a place and sit down with someone. This is from Leonard Sack's book, Collapse of Parenting. Father in Chicago calls his daughter at UCLA, Southern California, to wake her up and to give her her agenda for the day. Not quite fully formed humans. Now, I said there's 2 things I get hate mail for. Here's the next one. You always make your kids lunch. And I have a lot of people who write me back and say, well, when should they make their own lunch? And I'm like, as soon as physically, humanly possible, I suggest kindergarten. There's only 8 things you can take for lunch. Throw it on the counter, have them pull it into their bag and zip it up. They'll probably eat it because they put it in there. But the reason I say this is because of the advent of technology these days. If you can't show responsibility with little things, how will you ever show responsibility with big things? If you're going to want to be on an iPad or be on like an older iPhone at home, we're not giving kids that age technology, but they're using our old technology. You call your kids' teachers to argue marks as opposed to they talk to their teachers. How about when is a kid old enough to carry their own backpack? Have you ever seen a bus drop off kids and every parent grabs their own backpack? It's like, they can do their own backpack. This is all fear-based parenting. In Trophy Child, he says an interesting line that there's this interesting rhythm in our homes where we speed up our kids' early development. Music, movies, the news. I do like watching the news. I don't turn it on every day, but no one should have young children on with the news. Like 2 days ago was the large accident we had in Toronto where 4 people were killed. They showed the mangled car. It makes me nervous to see that. Picture a young child. And then we're watching buildings being bombed, wars all over the world. But this is an interesting line, and I think I'm going to go into this later, but Jonathan Haidt has a book called The Anxious Generation. And he talks about how we actually put too many things on kids in the real world, and then we don't do anything with them online. Like we let kids watch the news, the music, the movies, whatever. But in this line here, he says, and then they get older, and then we put the brakes on. In the book iGen, they now say that adolescence is an extension of childhood rather than the beginning of adulthood. It used to be a grade 11 or 12 was more like a college university kid. A grade 9 and 10 was more like a grade 11, 12. A 7 and 8 was more like a high school. It's all going backwards. Talk to a high school teacher. Grade 9s and 10s are now more like grade 7s and 8s. Talk to first year, second year college, university. They're more like high school kids. And the changes are radical that we've seen. Driver's licenses have gone from 92 to 96% of all 18-year-olds to 42%, which is the new statistic as of December. But you can understand why. I ask, anytime I'm talking, hey, do you have your license? It kind of comes up in a conversation. If a young kid says to me, well, we live in a big city, well, we drive a van, can you hear the adults, right? Can you hear the parent in that? Because if you said to me as a 16-year-old kid, Brett, can you drive a bus? I would be like, yes. Like I was young and dumb, right? I could not drive a bus, but we were fearless. Today we become fearful, and fearful to a fault. Part-time jobs are down, but you learn so much working at a McDonald's or a Tim Hortons or a Home Hardware or whatever else. Religious affiliations down, dating is plummeting, face-to-face interactions, the new thing where parents say to me, my kids never leave the home. Sexual involvement is down, and one lady shouted out amen at one of my talks, and I'm like, this isn't because of some rich Christian sexual ethic, it's because no one's leaving the home, which is why pornography is through the roof. But sexual involvement's down. Now, as a side note, I do think we need a new paradigm in discussing and talking about sex. I polled 10,000 Canadian Christians, and 90% said their parents never address sex, sexuality, pornography, anything in the home. We do it a few times in youth groups, but kids don't come out every week, and 2 times out of a year is not many. Young adults is when you'll mess up most sexually from what we would call a biblical sexual ethic. You know, they're traveling, they're away at school, and then you get married, which we'd say now you're free to be sexually active, and now we'll never talk about it again for the rest of your life. These are the Christian couples who come into me with so much dysfunction. Sleep is down, exercise down, nutrition's down, but overfunctioning is up, anxiety and depression is up, screen time. I put purposelessness with 2 asterisks just because I don't know if anyone else agrees, but I see this growing purposelessness with young men. Everywhere I go, news, if you look at statistics, men are more likely to take their own life, men are more likely to drop out of high school. Every aspect of college, university has more women. One university has 75% women. And men are more likely to drop out, men are more likely to road rage, men are more likely to be purposeless in their mid-20s and so on. I don't know the answer, but I just know we need to begin to go, what do we do with this as adults, as educators, as churches, as leaders? I said this a moment ago, but in Anxious Generation, he says that we overprotect in the real world and we underprotect in the virtual world. This is a really good book, and I go back and forth because I do think it's a little on the fear-based side, but then it's all based on research. And I do think it's a very important one. And he actually puts forth this, and I'm still thinking through this, but he says we need to have kind of markers of different ages and stages. You know, age of roaming, apprenticeship. I really like this. I don't know how it actually implements yet, but I still think it's worth looking at. So to end the first section, which is the largest by far, I want to give you some main thoughts and the books. So authoritative parenting, love a lot, ask a lot. Don't overfunction. And once your kids are at a certain age, maybe grade 4, say to them, I heard this speaker talk about overfunctioning. Let me know if I'm overfunctioning. We do life with, not for our kids. There's a progression. I think of it like teaching a kid how to ride a bike. Hands are on their shoulders, hands are near them, hands are away. It's kind of like the analogy of we have 18-year-olds today with parents still having their hands on their shoulders, right? There has to be a releasing. In coaching, I used to coach rep baseball, and the first game we played, did I or the other coaches play baseball? No. But we coached our kids to go play. And I think it's a great analogy for life. Whatever age and stage your kids are at, have you coached them to head into whatever environment it might be? And some good books. The first one and the third one we've addressed, Hold On to Your Kids by Gordon Neufeld and Gabor Mate is phenomenal. I'm just not using a quote. An older book called Dr. Karen's Guide to the Teen Years, and Free Range Kids is kind of like free range chickens. There's a woman in Winnipeg who called Child Protective Services because a 16-year-old rode his bike home from school alone. And they opened up a case. I rode my bike to and from school when I was in grade 1, multiple kilometers. We, by the way, live in the safest society ever. But we think it's not because of 24/7 news, right? If today in Ohio something happens, right away it's on our ticker. So how we parent matters. Now that we're thinking about parenting, the question is, well, are we spending time with our kids? Because the greatest gift is time. We could make a huge argument the greatest gift we can give our kids is failure. They fall down, they get up. Someone would say, what about Jesus? And I'm like, of course, we're just talking about a different conversation right now. It's just different. Psalm 90:12 says, teach us to number our days that we might get a heart of wisdom. There's a really interesting analogy of marbles, which is the day you have a child, you have 936 weeks, 936 marbles until your kid is 18. Now, this is not a perfect analogy unless your kid is born like June 25th or whenever the end of the school year is. But the thought would be, if this was a number of years ago, my kids were in high school, and I got invited to come speak here, and this was one of their birthdays, I would say, thank you so much. Could we push it forward or back a weekend? Because I didn't miss any of those. Because I knew the day they went away for school, I've not hit a birthday yet for 4 years for my daughter, for 3 years for my son. And it's okay. Because they're in school, right? They're doing different things. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's just looking at how you spend your time. And I kind of like the idea of by the time they turn 18, if there's any marbles in the jar left, dump them out. And then I call this doing a marbles analogy with a twist. Every time you do anything for your kid, anything, you then put a marble back in the jar because you're never done. right? Whether they're dating, engaged, you have grandkids or other things, every time you do something for your family, put a marble back in the jar, which is such a great thought. So 4 quick thoughts. Go up about 4 slides here. Morning time, drive time, meal time, bedtime. Morning time, I was always the morning person, so I just got my kids ready, whatever they needed. Quick prayer, encouragement, off they went. Nighttime, my wife, I go to bed early. Drive time, if your kids ever say to you, can you all drive me somewhere? Have you ever been in a van with like 5 grade 6 kids? It's like you don't even exist, right? They just start talking. And the best conversations I've ever had with my kids are driving. For everyone, mealtime is the best return on your investment you could ever have. Multiple peer-reviewed research studies say if you have 3 dinners a week as a family, all negative things go down. Now, if you're like, wow, my cooking is just that good, it's the people. It's sitting around a table, right? It's the community and all of those things. And I say bedtime matters for all stages except for teenagers, because if you're tucking in a teenager, let's just be blunt, you're over-functioning. I have people challenge me on that. I tuck in my 20-year-old every night. I don't think I'm over-functioning, and another conversation for another day. So, time, marbles. I actually think this is an analogy you can do physically. I have marbles at home that I used. You can also, instead of using physical marbles, I've had people use pennies before. They're hard to get now. One person used M&M peanuts and then had his marble jar in the sun, ended up with 1 marble. The whole thing just melted together. You can also use an app called the Parent Cue, C-U-E. It's a free app by Fuller University, which has podcasts and blogs on it. It does the marbles analogy for you for free. Scheduling is really just the simple idea of when your kids are young, they're always with you. Then you go through what I call the driving years, when you're always driving to soccer and dance and baseball and whatever else. Then your kids get their licenses at some point, hopefully. And then we plan family nights, because it switches. And the rocks analogy is really the one that we need to take leadership of parents. It's the big rocks go in first, small rocks second, sand goes in last. Sand is social media. Sand is television, sand is video games, but the big rocks are faith and school and family and friends and exercise and all those kinds of things. And 3 suggestions here, and these are all online as well, but Josh Shipp's book, The Grown-Up's Guide to Teenage Humans, which is the best name of a book ever. Power of Moments by Dan and Chip. This is the idea of moments matter, celebrating the good things. In our house, we use what's called the family gold plate kind of thought. When it's a birthday, that person, it's just a cheap dollar store, massive gold plate. It's not even a gold plate, it's fake spray painted. But when they get it, it means today's your day. We all have to go around the table and saying, here's what we love about you. It means it's your moment. And fair play is one that I take all my couples through, and I just think we have to get better at this as adults. So this is talking about basically, we used to just call it household labor or household management, and now I just say it's like, our houses are like a business. They have to be run right. Let me tell you my failure with this. It was a number of years ago, my wife came downstairs and said, Brett, so it's your dad's birthday today. She said, there's a card on the table, there's a pen beside it. So in my thoughts, in that moment, I said to myself, I'm a man-child. It's my dad's birthday. I have no idea. And my wife not only said it's his birthday, there's a card. I pictured her going click, click with a pen and putting it out like I'm an 8-year-old. Then she said, there's a present beside it, it's wrapped, and we're seeing your parents for lunch. This is what we call invisible labor. It's also called emotional labor. And it's something I think we as Christians are not doing great. And as a couples therapist, my Christian couples are often worse than non-Christian couples, which concerns me. And so you think, for me, my dad's birthday, what was in my head for this? Nothing. What did my wife do? So on her way to or from her visits, she's in home care management. She had to go get a card and get a gift, which meant calling my mom and saying, what does my dad want? Then she wrapped it, meaning she had to make sure there's gift wrapping paper and tape and a bow. And then she wrapped it, and then she called my parents and booked lunch. So I think it's 13 things, and I didn't have anything. It's a really good book. And in it, there's also, you can buy a deck of cards, and just as a couple, work through what people do. And I love the simplest thing of, as long as you both have the same amount of free time, you're probably good. But if one person has 5 days a week with 2 to 3 hours a day and one has nothing, not okay. How we do this is something that we then model for our children, which is really important. So time matters. So now we're doing the right parenting kind of styles, and now we're doing the right time, and now we look at communication. Do our kids only think we love them when they get good grades or when they follow our rules? And so what we say matters. And this is so the Gottman Institute is I'm a couples counselor often, and Gottman is like one of the main people in the world for couples counseling. But he has a thing called the Emotions Coaching Course. Go up one more slide. It is a emotion coaching course. It is a amazing course. It's $79. It's American, but it's teaching your kids how to deal with emotions. As a side note, it helps us with adults and us as men who are often, I generalize, not great with emotions, get better at it. So a few thoughts kind of on communication. What happens if your relationship is broken? Gary Chapman says, well, first say, I'm sorry. There's something incredibly powerful when an adult says to a kid, I'm sorry. I don't sleep well. And when I don't sleep well, many of us don't sleep well, but you don't wake up smiling and happy. You wake up, I need a coffee and I need a few minutes. And I've not always been the nicest to my kids. I'm not yelling or swearing at them. I'm just not as pleasant as I should be to my favorite people in the world. And I might have to knock on their door and say, I'm so sorry. My kids always will say, it's okay. I'm glad our relationship is good enough that it just needs an apology, but it's not okay. But number two, time or communication. This is the idea of we love our kids and we have different connections with them. My son and I've coached every team he's ever had in his life. I've had more time on the field. I've had more time in like Boston Pizza, eating wings after a game and driving to different things. My daughter was a gymnast and a dancer. I always threaten to coach her dance class. It's a joke you can say once in life. But my daughter Zoe and I, we always had to work on our relationship. Doesn't mean we don't have a relationship. It's just different. My son and I, every time sports things are on, my son will be texting me about the Leafs or the Raptors. My daughter, well, maybe now that she's working for the Raptors, a different story. But my daughter and I both love chicken shawarma. So anytime we're together, we'll get dinner. We both love coffee and iced coffee. So every time we get one out at a restaurant, we take a picture and send it to each other. But what if it's still broken? Counseling. Can we just normalize counseling? I don't think people need to be in counseling the rest of their lives, but just to get some thoughts and some tips, or even just some family counseling on how to get better in these things is a good thing. And this might sound like a weird question, but are we actually listening to our children? As someone who spoke predominantly to youth for 10, 15 years, and now predominantly to adults, the number of kids who would say to me, I went to my mom, my dad, and I said, I'm struggling with, add in anything like on this list here, eating disorder, self-harm, drugs and alcohol, and the list goes on. And the person said, you're okay. And then they never addressed it again. Or they said, I'll pray for you, and then never addressed it again. I think that's using prayer as a crutch, by the way. Should we pray? Of course we should. But why? I'm going to take a quote out of context, but Martin Luther King Jr. once said, there comes a time when silence is betrayal. When someone you love more than anything in the world says to you, I'm not okay, that means they're not okay. Now, we might not know what to do. So what do? We say, I love you so much. We'll get through this together. But you might have to say, I just need to have a quick conversation with my youth pastor, my pastor, a friend of mine, a mentor, another adult, and learn what to do. And never forget you're being watched. I was at a conference with pastors, and I said the line that was told to me at my master's degree, which is, the church is answering questions that no one's even asking. And a pastor came up after and he said, that one rocked me. And so he texted me and said, I'm going to offer my church two sermons this year, whatever they want. And so he put out a poll, and they said mental health and pornography. So he texted me back and said, so when are you coming to speak on mental health and pornography? And I'm like, mental health, wonderful. I said, you want me to talk on pornography for a Sunday morning service? He said, that's what people like unanimously said they wanted. So I finished the talk. It went over actually very well. It's nothing graphic, but like, how do we as Christians take our ancient faith and connect it with this modern world, especially with something like pornography? I'm on my way home, and a young 18-year-old boy, this is through email this time, and he messages me and says, hey, if I ever struggle with pornography, can I talk to you? I'm like, yeah. Why wouldn't you talk to your dad, the associate pastor of the church I just spoke at? And this is how our messages went. He said, well, I got in the car after your sermon this morning, and my father got in, and my 2 teen brothers and sisters and my mom, and we're all there, and the first words out of my dad's mouth were, what kind of stupid person gets addicted to pornography? And he said, My dad told me in that moment he's not a safe person to talk to about anything ever again. I talk about your influence. First off, where is the grace and the mercy and the compassion? We are the church. We're the hope of the world. Come with whatever people are dealing with. Come in. We will journey with you. Do our kids know that no matter what happens, that we want our kids running to us, not from us? If your kids are ever at a party as they get older and they get drunk or high, we want them calling us to drive them home, not doing something, getting in a car with someone who's drunk. Communication matters. So make sure we're listening. For some of us, we can be strategic. If you go into my Amazon thing, you'll find these cards. They're called talking point cards, and there's boxes of questions. Kids, teens, there's actually one for Christian faith, one for support, which is teaching emotional connection, couples, all these great ones. Love languages is just kind of knowing. I'm assuming we've all heard of love languages. We love and receive love in different ways, acts of service, physical touch, these things. Do we know what our kids like? And then family meetings. I have a YouTube video on this. Every year we have a singular family meeting in August and we talk about everything. We're going to be a Christian family. What does that mean? Everything from vacations. If we're going to go on one, we're going to have to be careful with money. It might be your Christmas and birthday gift. We're going to have to go somewhere cheap, but we talk about it. Like when they were little, do you need new shoes? Do you need new cleats for baseball? Whatever else it might be. But we found, and it's still to me this most precious moment, even though my kids are now in their 20s. I mean, our meetings are kind of different now. We say, like, other than our money for school where we can help you as much as we can, what do you need? And our kids talk about how just when I just need to vent and I FaceTime you and I just need 5 minutes of your time, you're always there. Like, it's like, okay. Some book suggestions. You can see these starting to repeat. I talked a few minutes ago about the purposelessness growing in men. And if anyone remembers many years ago, the movie Failure to Launch with Matthew McConaughey and Sarah Jessica Parker. So Failure to Launch, the book. What's interesting about this to me is when we see kids, especially men, mid to late 20s and into 30s, living in a basement, not working, struggling, the answers are very simple. So a lot of it is about lagging life skills, undiagnosed mental health conversation, over-functioning adults. And my thought is, why don't we read a book like this way in the future when our kids are even young or in middle school, and then make sure we instill these things in our kids. This is called like an upstream mentality. Before everything bad happens, could we kind of get in front of it? And there's another book by Adam Prince called He's Not Lazy. And lastly, discipline. Ron Morris comes and travels and speaks to educators. He says this: discipline is about teaching children to behave properly, not punishing them for behaving badly. When I first made this talk, I'm like, I'm only going to use one slide. I'm just going to use that because it's actually a very differing view. But then I've added some things in. So Ross Greene, in his book, The Explosive Child, says one of my favorite lines: let's go back to kids do well if they can. It's the most simple line. And if they can't do well, how do we teach them to do better? So here's just some kind of thoughts. Now, to go along with that, Ross Greene talks about how challenging behavior occurs when the demands we place on a kid outstrip their skill sets. So how do we teach? So just some thoughts, very, very basic thoughts. Number one, we need a relationship for influence with our kids. So this next slide is really busy, but if you look across the top, it's talking about how many hours a day we have kids. All I want to look at is these two balls. This one says positional influence, this one says relational. So positional influence, when you begin with a baby, you have 100% positional influence. Meaning, we have a baby here, like if you are like, I don't like this Brett guy, you get up and you leave and the baby goes with you. But if you're here today and you have an 18-year-old beside you and you're like, I'm leaving, your kid might say, oh, I'm not, I'll get a drive home by so-and-so. If we're parenting by about grade 4, from a positional standpoint, we already know we're in trouble, right? You're having this abrasiveness and relationship like that because we're trying to position by, I'm the parent, do what I tell you. Relational influence begins at nothing. And over thousands of evenings having conversations, going for walks, going to church, out for a meal, vacations, you name it, playing a game, you grow a relationship to where, when I say to my kids a few years ago, it's New Year's Eve, everyone's heading out somewhere different. Both of my kids somewhere, my wife and I, to a New Year's Eve party, and I just said, you got a minute? Both of my kids went, sure. because they know I have their best interest at heart. They know, all I just said was, just remember tonight, right? Living in the world and not of it. Like, what does it mean to live a Christian value when you're out? Be careful. There's a lot of people on the roads who might be drunk or high. And I hugged, kissed, gave them a prayer, and went off we went. But they know I have, like, that's that relationship we build. Number 2 is clear, agreed on expectations and consequences. So another busy slide with 3 different walls: stone walls, wild field boundaries, and picket fence. So a stone wall it's kind of like, we made the boundary. We're the wall. I'm the parent. This is what the rule is. Number 2 is wild field boundaries. I'm at a talk and a father comes up and he says, so I grounded my kid because he was late for curfew. And I'm like, curfews and grounding in the same conversation. When's his curfew? I said. He said, he doesn't have one. I said, sorry? I said, you grounded your kid, why? He was late for curfew. Okay, great. When's his curfew? The father said, he doesn't have one. And I said, I have no clue what you're talking about. And his father actually said out loud, he should have known when he should have been home. That's a picket fence like a wild, like there's no boundary. What we should have is picket fence boundaries. Rules are clear, they're flexible, and they're negotiated. Summer of grade 8. My son says it's an August night. Don't you miss August nights? Like, it's this beautiful night. He just says, can I stay out later? And I think it was 10 o'clock. And he said, can I stay out till 10? And we're like, all right. What is it with us as adults? At 5 to 10, I'm looking at my watch going, he's got 5 minutes. At 10 o'clock, I'm sitting at the front of the house. At 5 after 10, I am furious because my kid's not home. He's an amazing kid who never does this, and I'm angry. He comes to the door, and I literally go to do this, and he says, I know I'm late, let me tell you why. And I'm like, just let me yell at you for a second before you say that to me. He says, we were all out. He says, my alarm went off. His alarm went off because we teach, like, he's not suddenly at 9:45 thinking, I have to go home. So his alarm went off. Him and his friends are all kind of dispersing on the way home, and suddenly it was him and a friend of his left, and she said, so she lives down like the darkest road ever to her subdivision, and he lives like full street lights to his, and she said, hey, do you mind walking me home? It's dark. And my son looked me in the eyes and said, I knew you'd rather me walk her home and be late. And you ever have that pit in your stomach? Like, I almost ripped into this kid for being the kid I hope he would be. Now, we have a good relationship. Even if I had gotten mad, I could have apologized and gotten through that, but I said that at another talk, and a woman said, well, nothing good happens after 10 o'clock. And in my head, I'm like, wow, we sound old. We forget what it's like to be young. I'm 53. At 10 o'clock, I'm going up to bed, and I'm asleep by 10:30. There will come a season in life when our kids are driving out of your driveway as you're going to bed, and that's actually normal. The idea of nothing good happens after 10, now I'll give you a bit of a discussion on a bad environment could corrupt, but I think good kids are good kids. A good Christian worldview creates good values, creates good actions. And does anybody remember, like I remember the first time McDonald's went 24 hours, sitting in it having nothing but fries because they could let you stay until like 2:30 or 3 in the morning. Just chatting, just having fun. And remember walking on a beach or just hanging out and playing the game Risk, which never ended. But I like this. But some parents fail to realize that it's the job of every child to tear down their parents' fences and build their own. This is another stop quote for me. So this kind of thought here is, what kind of things are your fences and not their kids? Like, I want my kids to love Jesus because they love Jesus, not because I love Jesus. They're very, very different things. I want my kids to get good night's sleeps because they think it's important, not that I do. My wife and I'm putting this quote in the talk, and we had kids in grade 11 and 12 at the time. She says, what do we have in our house? What fences are we doing that need to be our kids? And we both laughed and went, curfews. So we abolished curfews in grade 11 and 12. Someone said the next talk, your house must have been chaos. And I'm like, why? Like, it's interesting. It's always right to fear. We knew within 1 year my daughter would be at Western. We knew within that year she would be literally on her own, and she could be staying up to whatever she wanted. So we wanted to release and let's see what would happen. So we didn't just say to our kids, do whatever you want. For the first 6 months, they didn't know. Every time they'd say, what time should I be home? We'd say, when would you like to be home? And they began 9, 10, 11, 12. One day my daughter said 2:30. Like 2:30. I said, what are you doing? One of her friends was flying back from a vacation, and they wanted to sit and look at pictures. And I'm like, okay. Next morning, she's exhausted. She says, wow, I'm tired. And I'm like, okay, there's a bit of learning in there somewhere. But the idea is both of my kids, it's this progression of parenting. Both my kids headed away to school. When your kids get to a place where they move away, are they ready to deal with boys, girls, dating, sex, pornography, alcohol, drugs, media, public transit, cooking, laundry? Like kids become confident when they're competent, right? It's teaching these competencies that then we create these confident kids. And lastly, punishment versus training. Ron Morris says, you have to decide what you're all about. Are you here to give children the punishment and consequences they deserve for failure, or the training and support they need for success? This is not my line, and I don't know where I pulled it from, but it's all good discipline has a purpose to it. Which is why one of the biggest questions in a Q&A is, I have a teenager, should I take away their phones? And my response is actually no, unless the phone is the issue. Because if your kid is fighting with their brother or sister and we take away phones and a week later we hand it back, have they learned anything? Because that doesn't mean there's a disconnect with that. I think we also forget that phones have become a new rite of passage. I do think the grade 7 or 8 is when kids probably should get a phone. I think that social media should be pushed to 16. But when kids have technology, it's not just a phone. It's now a lifeblood to everything. My kids would have their little group chats with their friends from church and sports and camp and school and other things. So I have 4 slides I want to put on spanking, and every time I get here, I just want to kind of click forward a few times, but I want to give you my thoughts, and I'll just say this. If you and I are different, it's okay. You and I can have differing thoughts and still be brothers and sisters in Christ. So I am against spanking. I don't think it's biblical, and I don't think it works. And let me walk through that. My wife spanked our daughter multiple times. She'll explain why. There's a quote that will actually go through that. I do think you could be a good parent who spanks. I think incredibly quickly it leads to abuse. The number of people in therapy. I took a mainstream master's course in psychotherapy. In our literature, it talked about in Christian families, the growth of abuse from spanking. And then if you don't discipline, by the way, I discipline, I just don't use spanking, right? We have to make a delineation between, it's not like my house was a free-for-all, we just didn't use punishment in that way. But sometimes if there's no spanking, people believe there's no discipline. So first off, not everyone who is spanked is forever damaged. I'm the son of a principal. I got spanked at home. I got strapped at school. Anyone remember those days? My principal actually strapped me in kindergarten for I don't even know what. And number 2, not everyone who's not spanked is spoiled, right? These are these extremism conversations. Now, if we're going to look first from a biblical standpoint, we look at Proverbs 13:24. There are a few other instances in the Bible that uses the term rod, but this is the main one. Proverbs 13:23, he who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is careful to discipline him. Every time, and I've been very fortunate over the years, I've been all over North America, and there's often a systematic theology professor in the audience from any Bible college, from any denomination. Afterwards, if I find this out, I'll say, can I ask you a question? There's a few of these debates that we have. And so here's what I've said. Can I ask you a question? They say, sure. I say, Proverbs 13, 50% haven't let me finish the 24. 50% go, it's not about spanking. They don't even let me finish the sentence. The other 50% let me finish the sentence and then say no. I probably talked to 400 professors in 20 years. Not a single professor has ever said yes, which floors me. There's a pastor in Toronto who actually says, it says a rod, we should hit our kids with physical steel rods. It's a sermon from last year in Toronto. And so I hear that and I'm like, are we on the same team here? Are we part of the same group? So here's what a few of the professors say. The rod is a shepherd's rod, and a shepherd guides their sheep. They don't beat their sheep, they guide their kind of sheep around. I like that. What the majority of them say is you need to get into the definition of rod and how most of the Bible says the rod or a rod. A rod's not the baseball player from New York Yankees, a rod like a physical rod. Go to the books of Exodus, a rod, like when an Egyptian beats an Israelite to death, bad. A rod, right? It's a rod. But what they say is the rod is a construct. And if you read the rest of the sentence, so he who spares discipline hates his son, but he who loves him is careful to discipline him. And I'm like, that's It's a very, very different meaning. It's interesting sometimes, though, when we all read the same passage and have differing views on it. Now, I've had multiple people write me and say, if you don't believe in spanking, you're not a Christian. And I'm always like, Trinity, resurrection, like this is Christianity? Like Christianity is not spanking or not spanking. We also forget for kids that their controls are very fragile and are kind of challenged by fatigue and hunger and frustration. So we can debate this all day long. Number two, does it work? This is the largest study ever done. Someone shouted out, how many kids? And I said, 160,000 for 50 years. The person sat down. And they've said there's no clear evidence of positive effects. It works in the moment, but you know what it affects? It affects your relationship. And so I just kind of leave this. But Ron Morris says, research says that whether a child gets a punitive spanking or not is hardly ever determined by the child's behavior. It's almost always determined by how the adult's day went. And that's why children don't get spankings at 8 in the morning. They get them at 8 at night, when an adult who is tired, frustrated, and exasperated starts to hit a child, and it should not be about us. That quote is what my wife says, that was me. I was exhausted. I was like up at night, all these other things. And if you're like, well, what do we do instead? There's 2 different things by Sheila Gregoire. If you don't know Sheila Gregoire, she's a Christian from Belleville, Ontario, who speaks on sex, sexuality, and marriage. She has 2 whole podcasts on things that we can do other than spanking. One person said, give me an example. And so I'm like, all right, natural consequences. I'm at a talk and a father said, I grounded my grade 10 this week because he didn't wear a coat to high school. Well, let me tell you my differing view on that. My grade 10 walks out the door. It's -10 outside. I'm like, Ben, I'm about to say, you don't have your coat on. I'm like, he's in grade 10. Have a good day, bud. He's like, see you, Dad. He comes to the door, 3:30, whatever it is. The first words out of his mouth, why don't you tell me to wear a coat? I'm like, because you're in grade 10. And you saw his little smile, and he's like, yep. We never talked about that again. There's natural consequences for some of these things. But all I just say is think on some of these things. So teaching, a discipline is about teaching. I always love this idea. If a kid can't, how do we teach them how to? Have a better relationship. Do better in whatever aspect of life. Make sure you have a good relationship for influence. I love the idea of rules are kind of thought through together. And this is one of my favorite little bylines, connection before correction. And there's some really, really great books. This is one, go up one. This is one on emotional intelligence by Daniel Goleman, which is quite good. On the far right is Boundaries with Kids. There's also one on boundaries, which I think every adult should read, but there's a lot of really great content there. So this image is like us and a million roads and a million directions, and the question is, so what do we do now? And you can add more things to those 4 things I did, but I think that helps begin creating this foundation for us. And from this relationship, now we have to parent. Parent what? Everything in this world we live in, to equip our kids to be successful in life. I'm going to give you a few very quickly and we'll be done. Family discipleship is the first one, right? It's the idea of spiritual life and making our kids fully devoted followers. So very simply, I love this idea of chasing your kids' worldviews. Your worldviews shape your values in turn shape your actions. I have an entire chapter in my book on family discipleship, right? Family discipleship isn't just parenting, it's more of a singular look at our kids and faith. And there's wonderful books on this. Sticky Faith is a very interesting one. It talks about markers of people who are still in faith. Like, I can't talk to everyone who's listening or watching this and say, like, why are you here? Because what I want to know are, why are the people not here? Where are those of us who grew up in church and we're not here anymore? But some of the markers are things like family dinners, getting connected with an adult who's supportive, sleepaway summer overnight camp. Like, the markers are fast. There's so many great camps, but it's having your kid stay overnight at a camp, and there's to them they're adults, but they're literally just like university, college age kids who are helping support them. And also equipping them from a faith standpoint. There's an app called Read Scripture. Read Scripture has these cartoon drawings, like these videos, before each book of the Bible. Like, before you read Second Kings. You're not reading it and going, oh, this all makes sense. For many of us, it's a confusing kind of book, but you do this 11-minute video and it shows how many chapters, the main theme, and then you read it and you're like, oh, this makes a bit more sense. Media is just a conversation we need to have. Now, I'm not doing my media navigating everything conversation, but the Google Doc is online. But I do think we need to try to find a way to not be fear-based, but also not put our heads in the sand. Like if I said to you, how many of us opened our phone today and scrolled through for 8 seconds and turned it off and put it down? Like hands would go up, because we've hit a weird place where our technology is starting to rule us more than it should. And so how do we take back control and take the good and get rid of the bad? Mental health we'll be doing tomorrow morning, but this is something we need, and I think we need to look at a prevention conversation for this. I have a talk on dating. It's called Dating for Life. It's on my YouTube channel. If my hair is black with blue highlights, no, it's 15 years ago, wrong talk. This is Dating for Life, the questions. It has like wood paneling behind me. But it's really the questions, and this is something you can put on for a middle school or above kid. What is dating? How do we date? All those kinds of things. Even how do we break up? Sex and sexuality, this is just something we need to talk about. And people say, you mean like birds and the bees? And I'm like, yes, but never use that term again, because no one knows what it means anymore. But we need to talk about this, just looking at life, because this and pornography has become... Barna this week released a new statistic just showing again the growth in the last, I think it was 4 years. It's another like 6% growth for men and for women. And so you can find all these online. Even my mental health talk tomorrow you can find online. And I have 3 courses on Right Now Media, and your church has Right Now Media. But if you're trying to log in and you can't, just go to my YouTube channel. You'll also find these there. This talk today is built as a 6-week small group for parenting. My talk, Men Navigating Everything, can be found there, and my older talk on media is there as well. So some resources and we're done. My website is just my name. It's brettallman.com. At the very top is all my social media, including the little Amazon A. I think for people, what I do is every time I'm reading a book and I think this is a really interesting book, I go to the author's website and I go like Twitter, follow, LinkedIn, like, I go on all their things and like or follow and connect, because then when I'm on any social media, I'm just served some of the best content on the planet. You can also click on blog. You'll see all the things, and this is the Parenting Navigating Everything take-home. It's a living document, meaning I'm always changing it. And my website has, I think it's 1,500 articles, links, and blogs on all kinds of things. A couple things left. I wrote a book, and it came out just through COVID. Someone called it my magnum opus, and it's an interesting statement. This is everything I've learned in 27 years as a speaker. It is 6 to 7 books in one. It is humongous. It's more of an encyclopedia, though. The reason I made this is I began reading statistics that people don't read anymore. The most recent statistics is 57% of North Americans read 0 books last year. 0. Now, I mean, one stat I read says 90% of Christians don't even open the Bible Sunday to Sunday. Like, we need to look at getting back into reading. Like, we're great at doing 8-second reels, which is all social media these days, but books. But this is meant to be the first 7 chapters are what we did today. And then the next 9 chapters are literally mini books on every single topic, from mental health, engaging the culture, media, sex, porn, dating, finances, education, substance abuse, and loneliness. There's a study guide for it. Some people do it as small groups, and it's on Audible. I read this myself. I don't know if you like Audible books. It's a long one. It's 23 3/4 hours long. So again, it's meant to be a choose your own adventure. 3 slides and we're done. People ask, how can they help? Pray. I posted about an hour before I started, setting up at your church, and my prayer team will pray not only today, but over the next few days from all over the world, praying for you as a church and church leadership and people, and I just love that. You can follow me on social media. We have a support page. It's either at the bottom of my website or it's out in the foyer right now, but we're trying to raise about $3,000 to film my media talk into a small group series to put on Right Now Media. And if you know someone who could like a talk, let them know. So where do you start? And I would just say, for where do you start? First off, no shame and no condemnation is a thing to always remember, right? Like, We do the best we can until we know better, and we know better, we do better, even if it's for the next generation. But it's John Maxwell who says my favorite kind of line. He says, when you hear someone, when you're challenged by someone, choose one thing. So what is one thing I said today? And you're like, that's for me. Like, I think if you don't have one, family dinners and family meals, same thing, family dinners and family meetings. But whatever it is, start with that. But here's what he says. Choose one thing, but you only have 3 days to do something about it. So whether you're here today or if you're listening online, like, you have 3 days from now to actually do something, or statistically, you never will. And the goal of a talk is like a catalyst, right? It's to spark us into thinking about different things and how to walk forward in these things for our kids, with our faith and our family and everything else. For those of you online watching this, you can always email me. I answer all my own questions. For those of you here today, I'll be out back. And for those of you who listen, I'll be here tomorrow morning as well. But thank you so much for having me out. And if anybody wants to chat, by the way, your baby was the most silent I've ever had in a talk, which is really nice. But thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye.